Hi everyone, Sarah here. Before we get to the episode, I just wanted to say thank you on behalf of myself, Brad, and everyone at AJFF for listening. At the end of each episode, we usually mention that you can leave us ratings and reviews, but I also wanted to take this opportunity to ask you to consider filling out our survey, which you can find online at ajff.org/inconversationpodcast. We are always looking for more ways to make the podcast even better and truly appreciate your feedback. I also wanted to mention that our next AJFF in Conversation webinar will be taking place this Sunday, July 26th at 12 p.m. Eastern. It will be on the coming-of-age dramedy, Flawless. This live Q&A event will be with the film's star, Stav Stroshko, the first transgender woman nominated for Israel's top acting prize. So please go to ajff.org/inconversationwebinar/flawless for more information on watching the film and registering. And with all of that, please now enjoy the episode. Hi, I'm Sarah Glassberg.
I'm Brad Pilcher.
And this is AJFF in Conversation, the podcast, where we talk about all things Jewish film. In today's episode, we're geeking out about superheroes and comic books.
As we move into the heat of summer, we should be chomping on popcorn while transfixed by the latest adventures of caped crusaders and tights-wearing demigods. These types of films have, after all, become the tent poles of our popular culture. But while you may know all the ins and outs of Marvel's cinematic universes, you may not know of the more hidden history behind the genre's Jewish identity.
Speaking of Marvel, Stanley Martin Lieber, better known as Stan Lee, was born to Romanian Jewish immigrant parents and went on to revolutionize comic books. He created flawed, complicated characters in stories that commented on the real world and dealt with issues of racism and bigotry. In large part due to this vision, superheroes went from godlike immortals to everymen and women.
And before Stan Lee was helping create the Fantastic Four and Thor, the Hulk and Iron Man.
And the X-Men and Doctor Strange and Daredevil.
And lest we forget your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, yes, before all of that, you had Jewish kids Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster giving the world a Superman to believe in. You had Bob Kane and Bill Finger creating Batman and Jerry Robinson adding the Joker and Robin. Jack Kirby and Joe Simon brought us Captain America.
Before Stan Lee revived Cap in the early 60s.
And all of that isn't even all of the Jewish creators who helped birth all of these characters who've come to define our cinematic times. So what of these Jewish roots remains with us when we watch the films like Superman, Superman Returns, Man of Steel, Wonder Woman, the X-Men films, all 7 of them, plus their spinoffs, Ant-Man, Ant-Man and the Wasp, the whole Avengers saga.
Okay. There's maybe too many films to get into in this one podcast.
Yeah, okay. There's too many.
But beyond the creators, what about all the Jewish actors and their portrayals of these beloved characters? Paul Rudd as Ant-Man comes to mind, or Natalie Portman as Jane Foster, aka the soon-to-be Lady Thor.
Speaking of female Jewish superheroines, we have to discuss Israeli actress Gal Gadot's turn as Wonder Woman.
For sure. Whether it's a Jewish sensibility brought to bear within the films, or maybe even controversy outside of the films, we will definitely want to talk about these actors and their performances.
And to help us unpack all of this, we have invited senior editor for Collider and good friend of mine, Matt Goldberg. He has written extensively on just about every single one of these superhero movies. Matt, thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
I have a question for you to kick us off, which is, in your opinion, who is the most Jewish superhero character that's ever made it to film?
I would probably say Superman.
Superman because
it's twofold. First, you have the creators, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, and it's an immigrant story. Basically, you have Superman coming from a home, coming to our planet. It's not his own, and making a life here. But it's also a Moses story. His parents put him in a basket to be raised elsewhere so that, for his safety. But he ends up becoming a leader figure for a whole people. Now, obviously there's divergences because he can't really lead the Kryptonian people because they are all dust. But the idea of, as a baby being, pushed towards this destiny, there are some parallels there. So, and it's interesting to me to sort of see, in recent cinema, Superman reappropriated as a Christ figure, when I think the Moses aspects of his origin are pretty clear.
The Christ-like portrayal of Superman has always been very interesting to me, because on one hand, I totally get it. Ever since the death of Superman in the 90s, it just seemed like the idea of this godlike figure sacrificing himself for the rest of us made perfect sense. So I'm not at all surprised that became an aspect of Superman's portrayal. But at the same time, I think you're right. To have an immigrant as the ultimate hero is something that is so resonant with the experience of young Jewish kids who are looking to imagine a dream world that was better than the world they were experiencing in the 30s and 40s. So, to me, it's the Moses parallels are there, but it's almost the fact that he's an immigrant. I mean, who puts an immigrant at the center of the story as the great hero and the protector, except for some Jewish kids in the 30s.
Right, exactly. It sort of turns it on its head of what we normally think about a superhero in terms of a character. If you go back to someone like the Spirit, but also Batman, Spider-Man, the idea of those characters is there's a regular guy, but he puts on a costume and he fights crime because this is his community and he belongs here, but he can't, he has to live these dual lives. And for Superman, it's the other way around. He is a super being, and he is not of this community. He was raised in it, but he is his powers come from the fact that he is not one of us. And I think that provides a really interesting push and pull in terms of the character. And it's always funny to me when people are like, "Oh, Superman's not interesting," and I think Superman's incredibly interesting. But you have to have the right angle on him. He doesn't present his darker qualities or more conflicted qualities in a way that like Batman does.
So you're a huge fan of Zack Snyder's angle on Superman, is what you're saying.
I just love it when Superman snaps people's necks. I think that really is. I love it as much as Zack Snyder does, as you've seen from that meme where he's just so happy to see that neck snap. Just really gives the moment some gravitas. I won't invite the wrath of the Snyder Bros right now.
Well, I mean, I will. The Snyder depiction of Superman is, to me, a guy who picked up the Christ allegory and didn't understand a whole lot else about Superman, and arguably didn't understand that either. But, his depiction of Superman and the death of Superman, and even the way that he chose to visualize Superman's death, and he leaned in hard to that aspect of Superman's lore in a way.
Right. Well, and I'll also and to be fair to Zack Snyder, Warner Brothers has wanted to do Death of Superman for a long time. Like it wasn't just like he came in and been like, "I'm doing Death of Superman." That was a studio kind of thing where you can see it in scripts before he even came in. Like the J.J. Abrams Superman flyby has a Death of Superman. Kevin Smith's abandoned Superman thing has Superman dying. Like the idea that Superman has to die has been an idea that Warner Brothers has been percolating. And it's kind of amazing that the one Superman film that we got before Man of Steel, Superman Returns, does not have him dying. That they were able to get away with that.
No, it has him creeping on a married woman outside of her house.
Yeah, much better. Much better. Boy, what a great duo for a Superman film is between Bryan Singer and Kevin Spacey. Just really uplifting stuff.
Oh God, we're not going to go there. But no, I mean, I think it's interesting though, because when I say that I think Snyder leaned into the death of Superman as a Christ allegory, I think that what was missing from the Snyder films, which I think was there in the character's portrayal, and I think was a very Jewish quality in the character's earlier portrayals, was when you watch Man of Steel and you watch Batman v Superman, what you see is Superman as very much apart from the society that he's operating in. He is not an immigrant who has sort of taken on the values and the best of the world in which he has found himself. He is an immigrant who never ever really feels connected fundamentally to the people around him, and who feels always apart from, and walking kind of on a tragic path that ultimately leads to his sacrifice. And that, to me, feels very much of a piece with the Christ story and the mythology around Jesus and the story of Jesus's life than it does what I think Superman was before that, which was, he's not from here, and his uniqueness, his powers are derived from the fact that he's not from here, but he's also enmeshed himself in our world and made himself of our world and our society, and he's absorbed the best principles and is now even more of an embodiment of those principles than people who were born here, who are human, who, it's their birthright. He has made it his own and become its greatest champion and greatest defender. And that's what's missing from those two films. And that's why I think Zack Snyder missed that part of the lore. And that's what I really mean by that.
No, I agree. I think his take on it, I think he even spoke to this in the run up to Man of Steel, is the idea of, he kind of saw Superman or Clark Kent as kind of a special needs child. Like the idea of if these parents were raising this kid who had these abilities and he wouldn't fit in, and you would just want to protect him and keep him safe and not let the world hurt him. And then, but eventually his journey is that he has to eventually show those powers to the world. So, and I think that's sort of the conflicted push and pull of Man of Steel, is that the idea that Superman has to be kept hidden at all costs. So as opposed to an immigrant story where it's all about assimilating and becoming part of America and joining that, most of Man of Steel is like, his dad would rather get sucked into a tornado than have his son show people that Superman exists. So it's that kind of weirdness of it. And then that kind of carries over again into Batman v Superman with the whole, he's just a very aloof character. And I wrote about this on Collider, that I think a film that's missing is a second Man of Steel, which kind of would deepen the character before you get to Batman v Superman. And that would at least allow you to get more in terms of his interior life and what he wants and who he is and why he is the way that he is. And unfortunately, because Man of Steel underperformed at the box office to Warner Brothers' expectations, it wasn't a flop, but it didn't gross like $1 billion like they wanted it to. They kind of hit the panic button and said, we need to team up Superman and Batman.
Yeah, it went off the rails. Sarah, I'm interested to hear who you think is the Jewiest superhero character other than Superman.
Okay, well, first of all, this is teaching me so much about Superman. Going into this, DC properties were 100% my blind spot. So I'm going to move us into Marvel territory and name Spider-Man as the character who I think is the most Jewish in representation, even though, at least as far as the films go, the character is never actually overtly stated as being Jewish. But I've always just gravitated towards Spider-Man, and I think a huge part of that is his sense of humor, even when storylines get really dark and bad things happen and things are really stressful for him as a teenager trying to grapple with these new powers and kind of live that double life, as we were saying. He always makes these like quips and these jokes. And leading up to today, I read an article that I think kind of gave me a foundation or an explanation for why I've always loved Spider-Man for that reason. And it's that he has this like Catskills comedian quality about him, this kind of sense of humor that is Jewish in sensibility. And again, I never would have put my finger on that for all of these years that I've loved Spider-Man, but reading that article made me it was like that aha moment where I'm like, oh, okay, so Spider-Man was written, and even after Stan Lee, no longer had the reins over that character, like that sense of humor is what remained in all future kind of iterations on screen and on the page of Spider-Man. So that's my pick.
It is a very Borscht Belt comedic styling, and I for one have no problem picturing Tobey Maguire or Tom Holland with a kippah on their head in synagogue. I have a harder time with the Spider-Man in between the two of them.
I'm really glad you didn't. Yeah, I wasn't sure if you were even going to go to the Andrew Garfield films. Like, that's such a weird sore spot for me. I don't know. There's just been so many Spider-Men.
Well, Andrew Garfield's portrayal of Spider-Man I love Andrew Garfield's portrayal of Spider-Man in a way, but when you're talking about the sort of historical roots of Peter Parker as a kind of nebbishy figure who is, because of his circumstance, because of his youth, because of all of the pressures of his non-superhero life, struggles with being a superhero in a way that a lot of other superhero characters do not, and certainly superhero characters before Stan Lee showed up to create all of these iconic figures at Marvel. That is a Jewish quality, and Andrew Garfield's character is almost too cool. I mean, he certainly struggles, but he never really loses the coolness. And what was great about the portrayal under Tobey Maguire is that he is nerdy. I mean, Peter Parker's a nerd in those films, and even when he's trying to be cool, which a deeply mistaken choice to have him go emo and start doing a dance on the sidewalk.
I'd say that's a brilliant choice. Because that's exactly how a nerdy person thinks would be cool. Like it completely fits with the character.
You're absolutely right on that level. In terms of execution and the use of sound, diegetic sound versus, it's the execution is not great, but you're absolutely right on that level. And that I think was my point, which is he is a nerd. So even when he's trying to be cool, he doesn't quite pull it off. And then, Tom Holland is less nerdy, but Tom Holland is, how do I phrase it? He's got that kind of shy, not quite 100% confident in himself, a little bit desperate. He's still cool, but he's got that hint of desperation in his portrayal that, again, to me, steeps him in that nebbishy Jewish ethos. I have no problem seeing either of those actors in that character showing up in Shul. It just makes sense to me.
Well, I think just in terms of the progression of these representations of Spider-Man, I agree with you. I think what I would kind of counter with is that I think the Tobey Maguire iteration, he gets the kind of, as you're saying, nebbishy qualities down. I think Tobey Maguire plays that really well. I think Andrew Garfield gets the humor a little bit more right. I think that the script in Mark Webb's iterations of Spider-Man kind of gets to those kind of, he's making quips at these criminals while he's fighting them. He gets that a little bit better than I think what's seen in the Sam Raimi trilogy. And then Tom Holland is like the perfect combination of the two. Like, I think it was two sort of like they tried two different formulas and each one was missing something. And then Tom Holland's is just like the best combination of all of those factors. Just that kind of nervous quality. He's kind of cool, but also a huge nerd. And he also looks like a high school student, which, I mean, Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire do not look like high school students, but I digress. So, yeah.
Well, it's funny. We actually have seen a Jewish Spider-Man on screen, and I'm wondering if you guys have caught it. Apparently not. It's Into the Spider-Verse. Peter B. Parker is Jewish. In the montage talking about his life, he steps on a glass during his wedding.
Yes. Oh my goodness, you're right.
Yeah, I completely forgot about that. Yeah. That's an Easter egg. That's got to be.
Yeah, it happens very quick. It's during the montage, so they don't really make a big thing of it. But yes, Peter B. Parker is Jewish.
We can't forget Into the Spider-Verse.
So, Matt, do you think Spider-Man, in relation to his roots as a character and in relation to that kind of Borscht Belt Catskills comedy that Stan Lee infused into him right almost at the very beginning, has he been well handled on film as a character?
It goes back and forth. I think in terms of the Jewishness of it, I would say that one of the things that I like about Spider-Man is I don't think he belongs to any particular group or creed. I think it's a very American myth, I guess, in that regard of the idea. And I think Spider-Verse has handled it the best, that the idea that anyone can wear this mask, because unlike Superman, who is born special, or Batman, who, is rich and can get these things, the power, Peter Parker's powers are bestowed on him through sheer happenstance. And more than that, they don't fix everything in his life. He still has to live a regular person's life. In terms of like his comedy, I think, it's kind of snappy. It's kind of in that realm. And I guess you can definitely see what's been infused there. But I don't know if I'd go, I kind of go back and forth on it, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that, and we should talk about Stan Lee here, because when we talk about Spider-Man, I feel like that is the one character, that comic sensibility that Spider-Man has, which is distinct from other superhero characters' comedic quippings, because comic book characters have always talked. They've been in the middle of fistfights and having extremely verbose conversations, which seems odd, but it's part of the form. But there's a generic quality to them. And Sarah, the article that you mentioned, which is a great article, I've also read it, it points to very specific dialogue very early on in Spider-Man's run. And the joke that he makes, when he's up on the ceiling and the Goblin is threatening him to bring him down to ground level. And he's like, but it's so nice and cozy up here. It's just that line of dialogue is distinct, not because it's a funny quip, because that wasn't new. It was that tone, that styling. And that is probably, arguably, Stan Lee's most Jewish contribution to his characters. He gets an enormous amount of credit for creating a lot of characters, and he deserves it. And he's arguably the most well-known comic book creator in the popular consciousness. He's had cameos in all these Marvel movies. He was beloved, rightfully so. But there's a lot of controversy because he took a lot of credit from other artists around the creation of these characters. And arguably, when we look back, we lose sight of the fact that some of the Jewiest aspects of his comic book characters were not his contribution. X-Men is a good example. X-Men have literal Jewish characters. Magneto, the great villain, is a Jewish Holocaust survivor. Kitty Pryde is Jewish. There are Jewish characters all through that franchise, but all of those characters' Jewish origins, and in some cases all of those characters, period, were creations post Stan Lee's writing tenure on the X-Men. So I'm curious how both of you feel about Stan Lee looking back. Obviously, he's dead now. We all love him. He's sort of like the cuddly grandpa that we all miss. But that aspect of his story is one that's not necessarily as well known by the mainstream audiences.
No, I definitely think there's some sort of that there's a mythology now that's sort of grown up around Stan Lee, especially that's been reinforced in the popular culture by his Marvel cameos. And he's like, it's totally Stan Lee. He's just this guy. But like, if you read something like Marvel Comics, The Untold Story, there's a lot of backbiting. There's a lot of controversy. And that's not to denigrate his memory. It's trying to be honest about it. And I'm really looking forward to Abraham Reisman's Stan Lee book that comes out in September to sort of get a fuller picture of the guy, because even now, people, with the Black Lives Matter movement going around and sort of making strides, people are sharing this Stan Lee editorial where he was talking about, the evils of racism. And yet there's also clips of like Stan Lee, who's not a huge fan of protest movements. So it's hard to sort of nail him down to any one thing. There's complexity there. And so I would definitely, be cautious of trying to put him in sort of a box and say, Stan Lee did X because of Y. I think that as a creator, you can sort of see the fact that he creates characters that are underdogs. It's a business decision because when you look over at DC, those characters are gods. They are simply God. They could even be, you could put them one-to-one with the Greek pantheon where, Superman is Zeus and Batman is Hades and the Flash is Hermes and so on and so forth. Marvel is about these sort of street level characters, these people that kind of have to live regular lives, but they also have these responsibilities. But I think that being able to side with the underdog and being able to sort of find them there is part of the Jewishness of Stan Lee. I think that he injected it in a way that I think perhaps someone who didn't have that background would not have put them in there.
I agree. I think Stan Lee gets a lot of credit for these large sweeping movements within the comic book industry, and whether that's fully deserved or there is a bigger picture there, I hope that the book that you mentioned, Matt, will kind of clear some of that up. But I think what's important here is that move from comic books to film, to movies. I think that that's really what sort of made Stan Lee this canonical figure, where he was making all of these Comic-Con appearances and then all of those cameos that you mentioned, Brad. And I think that, yeah, I do think that there's a sort of more complex story there. But as Matt mentioned, I don't think that we can really ignore the tangible kind of, strides that he made. He had that sort of soapbox part of the comics where he did talk about racism and bigotry, and he infused that into some of the stories, even if some of the characters weren't Jewish under his time, under his tenure. But it was that sensibility, right, of kind of fighting for the underdog, being the underdog, and being a realistic character. I mean, all of that was so new, and to what extent he should share that credit, I think that's obviously what time and history needs to perhaps do better to uncover. But I also don't think that him being this figurehead that then transferred over into all of these other media, I think that means something, because then we can do the work of looking backwards and saying, well, he had this he was the son of Jewish immigrant parents, and he had this sensibility, and he did speak out about certain things using the comic book form. And so I still think he's an important figure, even if he should maybe with time share some of that credit, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that I don't want to take anything away from Stan Lee, and that's absolutely not my intent. But I do wonder sometimes how much, what part of his contribution was just we were ready for it, that was the time, and what portion of his contribution is truly unique to his genius. I mean, I think that you're absolutely right. It was a business decision there. He needed to differentiate the Marvel stories and characters from DC, and he found a way to do it. And it just so happens that was a brilliant move in terms of creating compelling characters as well as a business position to be in. So, I give him an enormous amount of credit for that. But in terms of the Jewishness, I think, Sarah, you're probably right. It was just sort of that underlying sensibility, which has been there. There's so many Jewish comic book creators. I mean, Lynn Wein, who took over the X-Men franchise after it was brought back in the mid-'70s with Chris Claremont, and this was post-Stan Lee, and he's the one who sort of tweaked the Magneto backstory to be a Holocaust survivor. But that was a decade plus removed from the origin of the X-Men, and so would Stan Lee have done that if it was in the 70s? Maybe, but it's arguable that to create these superheroes and make them explicitly Jewish, we just weren't ready for that in the early 60s in a way that we were by the mid to late 70s. We weren't ready in the 1930s and 40s when Superman was created to have an explicitly Jewish character. Siegel and Schuster would never in a million years have identified one of their creations as a Jew. For that matter, they couldn't identify themselves as Jewish. They had to, in many cases, Stan Lee was not born Stan Lee. It was Stanley Lieber. So even then you had these characters who were sort of masking their Jewish identities professionally. So to me, I look at it as a timeline. I think that if Stan Lee had come along in the 1980s, we would have had a very different output from Stan Lee. If Siegel and Schuster had come along in the 60s, you would have had a very different output from them. So I wonder how much credit to give to the sort of circumstances in which these people were creating, and how much to give to them as sort of uniquely Jewish creators.
Well, I think it's both, but I think what Stan Lee did was just lay the groundwork. I mean, I think there are a lot of instances of, the world isn't ready for this or that, but you need someone to come in and start planting those seeds. And I think that's what Stan Lee did. And I think it's difficult to speculate now what he would have done more of or differently had he come around, in that industry later.
Matt, do you think, speaking of the X-Men, that they are the most Jewish franchise? And I'm not talking about just the characters. Obviously, Magneto being Jewish, there's Jewish Kitty Pryde. But in terms of the way that story and those characters have moved to the screen, because at this point we've got, I think, 7 films that are kind of the central story, but then you've got spinoffs, you've got Wolverine spinoffs. So you've got a whole film universe around the X-Men. And there's obviously a lot of themes in those depictions, but I'm curious how much you think the Jewishness survived that transition from comic book to film.
I feel like not a lot of the best aspects of the X-Men survived the transition from comics to film. I feel like the things that kind of made the most were the civil rights aspects, which have sort of, the X-Men started as a civil rights story, and that kind of was then refashioned to a story. It started about civil rights for Black people when the comic was created, and then when it came to the screen, it was more about civil rights for the LGBTQ community. And then sometimes that falls away, sometimes it resurges. I feel like the movies kind of take what works for them in certain moments. So for instance, in X-Men First Class, they really go into the Magneto as Holocaust survivor stuff. I think that they do it very well. I mean, the fact that one of the scenes is, Magneto has a nice childhood memory of celebrating Hanukkah is very potent. But by the same token, that kind of just gets completely forgotten by the sequels, and it all gets kind of muddled around. And the fact that the Magneto stuff is so strong comes from the fact that there was a Magneto spinoff that they were working on before they started First Class, and that just kind of got subsumed into First Class, which is why that film has like 7 screenwriters credited. But I feel like in terms of the Jewishness of it, I think it's kind of there, but honestly, I feel like it's most present as a civil rights story in the first 2 X-Men movies. It kind of resurges again with X-Men First Class, and then they just kind of forget about it. The X-Men films are very hit and miss.
They don't. If you think of the first trilogy as a distinct unit, and then you look at the films that were kicked off by First Class as a sort of they peak very early, and then they kind of trail off as you move through the later movies. I still wish that we had gotten a full movie of just Magneto as Nazi hunter. And
that was the plan. That was the idea was, so, they had X-Men Origins Wolverine, and then the idea was that there was going to be an X-Men Origins Magneto, but because X-Men Origins Wolverine was so poorly received, they kind of decided to pivot and push X-Men Origins Magneto into X-Men First Class.
That one scene that we get in Argentina with him is so good, and part of that is Fassbender's portrayal. Fassbender, just imagine an entire movie of Fassbender as Magneto hunting Nazis and the thing that he brought to that portrayal, which I thought was great, which is something that's been missing, I think, from a lot of the Nazi hunting genre, if you will, is the idea that the Nazi hunter, who is a victim and who you sympathize with, takes on the sadism of his tormentors. And that's what you got in that scene, which is why I wish we'd gotten a whole movie of, and Magneto is perfect as a character to do that with, because he is warped by his trauma, and it deforms his humanity in a way that makes him a villain later on. But at that moment when he's, you want to cheer him on. He's hunting Nazis, but you also see that sadism that he has, that he's revisiting onto these Nazis who tormented him. That to me is just, it's ripe, fertile ground for storytelling. And if there was ever a character that could do it well, it was Magneto. And I lament that we're never going to get that film.
Yeah. I mean, I think, it kind of I agree with you. I think that would have been a very strong film. But to look at the whole X-Men franchise, you can see that how badly it all goes off the rails by the time you get to X-Men Apocalypse, because the X-Men films, when in 2000, that was a big deal. The fact that the film starts in a concentration camp, the fact that it's a superhero movie, but that's where it begins is a big deal. And then by the time you get to Apocalypse, it's like, let's go back to Auschwitz, but also Olivia Munn is here in a bathing suit as Psylocke. And, you've clearly lost the thread, and I won't go into why, because it's not my place to do so. And I don't want to get this podcast in trouble on the air, but
please bring the controversy, Matt, bring it.
No, I'm not gonna spill the tea on the AJFF podcast, unfortunately, just because I don't want to get anyone in trouble.
No, I appreciate it. Sarah, what do you think about X-Men? I mean, it's a franchise that is much loved and much hated, and I'm just curious kind of how you received it.
So X-Men is such a mixed bag for me. And I also I used to love the new entries, particularly First Class and then Days of Future Past. But what this conversation is making me realize is just how uneven it is as a franchise in many respects, but in particular with regard to the lack of nuance. There are certain aspects, some of which you've already covered, that are really nuanced. Some of the performances are really good. I think Michael Fassbender and James McAvoy are way too good for these movies. But then you have, they're either too heavy-handed or they gloss over things. They have these big, broad strokes. I think Days of Future Past is sort of that. It's treads that line. It kind of is bringing out some of those themes that Matt mentioned, kind of the human rights, civil rights. I think it does it okay, but you can already see it heading into apocalypse territory where everything is just really overblown and you lose any sense of nuance. So, and I think it's just so hodgepodgey, like just from film to film, the way that it does treat the themes that made the X-Men so great in the comics. It just varies from film to film and even from character to character within the films. They're all kind of on different levels of that, of speaking to those themes, of taking particular care with certain themes. It just varies so much from film to film that it makes it almost hard to view as a franchise in totality. So that's my issue.
It is absolutely a franchise that swerves all over the place, and often not for creative reasons, just because, Bryan Singer wanted to go make Superman Returns, and so the third film in that trilogy kind of went in a different direction, and there's the behind the scenes reasoning, and Matt, you can speak to this better than anyone, without spilling any tea, is what drove that. And that's frustrating because to me, it's the franchise that has the most potential. I mean, I wish that I could have seen, in terms of potential around these themes, the sort of Jewish thematics, the stories that these characters carried, there was a huge potential there. And as a franchise, it's frustrating because it has kind of taken the idea of social justice and genericized it. Genericized is not a word, I know, but it is sort of, take your pick. Black Americans, for civil rights for them. LGBTQ Americans, civil rights for them. Mutant becomes just kind of a catch-all. And so in a way, it's watered down the unique horrors of persecution, of whether it's the Jewish persecution, and Magneto represents that, whether it's the Black persecution, whether it's LGBTQ, whatever, you sort of round off the hard edges of the specificity to these stories, and it becomes just a generic civil rights is good, totalitarianism is bad story. That's the only overarching theme of it. I mean, that to me as a viewer from a critical lens, that's the most frustrating part about X-Men, especially since it has such rich roots in terms, not just Jewish roots, but you've got Storm, you've got characters that embody personally these various persecutions, and their stories are just glossed right over. I don't know, Matt, if you feel the same way.
I do. I feel like the X-Men films, they are continually pushed away from their more interesting aspects to be the most bland, kind of broad civil rights, kind of like, mutant and proud. And I'm like, okay, that's nice. But the idea is that the films, they're sort of boxed in two ways, which one way is that they have to sort of be this kind of nice, kind of branded, corporate friendly message of like, so we stand for civil rights because civil rights, are popular. But, it also is a thing like they happen in a vacuum. Like we don't like civil rights are good. And it's not that anyone is against civil rights. So that leads to the second problem, which is that if you look at most of the most of the X-Men movies, they're about mutants versus mutants, which is great for blockbuster stakes. It's great to have mutant people with superpowers fighting off against other people with superpowers. That makes for more exciting fare, but it also misses the fact that the mutants are the persecuted people. That's the whole conflict. And so basically what's happened is that the movies remove the persecutor. They remove, I don't think persecutor is a word, but they remove the negative force and make it just mutants versus mutants. So it's like, there are mutants that want peace, but there are also mutants that want, to dominate. And so let's have them fight. And that's why I think like a film like Logan is one of the reasons Logan is so good is it's like one of the few, if I think might be the only one, where it's not mutants versus mutants. It's mostly just it's a character driven story, and so I feel like the X-Men films are largely. Well, I have a soft spot for them because X-Men was sort of my gateway to this world of superheroes and comic books because I really love the 90s animated series. I can admit that the films are deeply flawed, and my hope is that when they're rebooted that they'll finally get the justice they deserve.
Yeah. You can almost hear the, what about mutant on mutant violence from the sidelines, which before we leave the X-Men, though, Matt, is Wolverine Jewish?
Yes, I'm gonna. I don't know if that's a serious question or not, but I just want Wolverine to be Jewish because we need everyone on our team that we can get.
He's short.
He's short, and he's a little crotchety,
Yeah. He's got the sort of old Jewish grandpa. Because you think about it, you forget he doesn't look like it because he doesn't age in the way that a normal human does. But he's old. He's a crotchety old grandpa.
Well, you kind of do get that in Logan. You definitely get that more in Logan.
Yeah, but you forget that when you're watching this guy, whether it's the comic books or whether it's the early X-Men movies, you're like, oh, this is a guy who's in his late 20s, early 30s, maybe mid 30s. This guy fought in the Civil War. That was not a serious question, but I would love to claim him. I'm with you on that. But let's move away from characters and let's move away from creators. One thing I wanted to ask about is the actors that are portraying these roles, because I am of a certain opinion on this, but I know it's not everybody's opinion, which is I don't really care. But there's a lot of discussion that has been made about Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, Paul Rudd, and Jewish actors portraying these characters and what do they bring to the roles. And for me, the reason I say it doesn't matter is because Wonder Woman is not remotely Jewish. Her creators were not Jewish. There's really nothing about the character that strikes me as particularly Jewish. The fact that Gal Gadot is the actress who is currently portraying her and that Gal Gadot happens to be Israeli, just kind of, it's like a nice bit of trivia. And I certainly appreciate having a prominent Israeli actress in a major piece of pop culture. But beyond that, I'm like, it's not like there's a Jewish character here who I want to be portrayed by a Jewish. It's not like I want trans characters to be portrayed by trans actors, or I want black characters to be portrayed by black actors, or it's not that. But I'm curious if Sarah or Matt, if you have different perspectives, because look, we've got some phenomenal actors portraying this, and very proudly Jewish actors. Paul Rudd, Scarlett Johansson, Gal Gadot, the list goes on. So I'm curious if you guys think that it matters that there are Jewish actors in these roles.
You absolutely haven't. This is one of those episodes where I just love this topic so much, but I'm learning so much at the same time. That said, I could go on and on about this part of the conversation about actors, putting aside my personal obsession with Paul Rudd. I do want to talk about the Wonder Woman thing a little bit more. I do think what's interesting about the controversy that surrounded Gal Gadot's portrayal of Wonder Woman, I think that is something that we don't usually get when there's just this tentpole blockbuster superhero movie. I think the fact that Wonder Woman was female directed and had all of these amazing aspects about it that were just so female empowerment forward. I think that what was interesting is the conversation around that became, okay, well, what about intersectional feminism? Is Gal Gadot a white woman? Are Israeli women white women? All of these different political things that got projected onto Wonder Woman as a film. I found that very interesting. And I think that it was that one kind of shining example of how these films could matter for the real world in a way that's a little deeper than just our kind of nerding out about them. I think that it brought out a lot of conversations that were important. And on the flip side of that, to answer the question of does it matter to have a Jewish actor play these roles? I agree with Brad. I'm not saying that if there's a Jewish, if there's a Jewish comic book character, I think it'd be nice to have them be played by a Jewish person. On the flip side of that, these are not necessarily canonically Jewish characters in the comics. But I still think it's pretty cool if you are a Jewish kid to see something extra of yourself in what you're seeing on screen, and just to kind of have that representation. It's not as sort of culturally loaded as some of the other examples you gave, Brad. And I never want to sort of say that it is, but at the same time, I think it is cool. If I were like a little Jewish girl growing up and I saw this amazingly talented Israeli actress playing Wonder Woman, I would think that was pretty empowering. It's just that, we've talked about that in a prior episode, actually. Or, what Paul Rudd brings to Ant-Man is, again, that kind of sense of humor and the kind of star text around him as this Jewish comedic actor. I just tend to think all of that matters. So those are the kind of two ways that I'm seeing this conversation.
It is clear, I think, that Jesse Eisenberg should play the Thing in any future Fantastic Four, who is Jewish, by the way. The Thing is, for those who do not know,
I just wanted to say he definitely shouldn't have played Lex Luthor, to kind of refer back to that part of the conversation.
Technically he's playing Max Landis playing Lex Luthor.
Yeah, that was some bad casting. But no, and I'm joking here, but there are canonical Jewish characters, and having Jewish actors play them. I think you're right, Sarah. I often discount representation because it's something that I never noticed growing up. And I that's a blind spot that I have because I converted to Judaism. I grew up as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant male middle classes. I mean, every group that doesn't really face oppression, that was me as a kid. So for me, representation never really registered. And as I've gotten older, I have to remember that representation does matter for people. I do think it's true that, people who's little Jewish girls who look up and see Wonder Woman played by an Israeli Jewish actress, that matters. I always struggle with how much to look at the actors and the conversations that take place on the sidelines of a film that aren't really about the characters or what's going on screen, and how much to put those off to the side and not. Because you're right, Wonder Woman, the controversies around Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman really were about Arab-Israeli politics, or they were about feminist issues and the portrayal of women. I remember very distinctly when she was cast as Wonder Woman and she went on Jimmy Kimmel's show. And this may be just her kind of Israeli sensibility too, but he's like, I have a question. And she's like, is it about my boobs? And he's like, and you could see how flustered he was in that moment. And he's like, what? No, that wasn't what I was going to know. I don't want to talk about your boobs. And it was because she had been criticized for not being busty enough to play one, which was the dumbest criticism you could possibly get. And that's a fascinating conversation, and I think worthwhile conversation, but it has nothing to do with the character of Wonder Woman or the story that's going to be depicted on screen. And that's the frustrating part for me. But to flip it, and I will shut up now after I say this, and hopefully, Matt, you have strong opinions about this too. I do think Paul Rudd, I have to assume he brought something to the portrayal of Ant-Man that is steeped in his sensibility, which is a kind of Jewish humor, because Paul Rudd, like that Ant-Man and the comic books bears very little resemblance to the way that Ant-Man has been depicted on screen. I know that there was backstory around Edgar Wright, the original director on those films. So Matt, I don't know if you know anything that I don't know about Paul Rudd and the way that character was shaped, but that's one where I do think the actor had a lot to do with the way the character ended up coming across.
He absolutely did. I mean, Paul Rudd is a credited screenwriter on Ant-Man because, so for those who don't know, basically Ant-Man had kind of a tortured production. It was originally going to be one of the earliest films that Marvel wanted to make. Edgar Wright was signed on. I mean, back in the days of like Iron Man, it was like Iron Man, then Ant-Man, and then Edgar Wright had to press pause. Well, first he was going to direct Scott Pilgrim, and then he was going to go direct Ant-Man. But then he had a friend who was dying of cancer, and this friend wanted him to finish out the Cornetto trilogy, so he went to go direct The World's End, and thankfully that friend recovered. But by the time Edgar Wright had kind of gotten finished with all of that, Marvel had changed a lot. A fun little side note is that the two finalists for Ant-Man were Paul Rudd and then another Jewish actor, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who Marvel wanted for the role, but Edgar Wright pushed.
Oh, God. Thank God they passed Paul Rudd.
Well, and Edgar Wright pushed for Paul Rudd. He had a very clear vision. And then the problem was that Edgar Wright kind of wanted to make an Edgar Wright film and Marvel wanted to make a Marvel film. And those two things are very different by the time Ant-Man is about to start shooting. And so Edgar Wright leaves the project and it's kind of thrown up in the air, and Paul Rudd starts taking on screenwriting duties to sort of help reshape this thing. And so Paul Rudd's sensibilities are very much a part of Ant-Man and what that film is. What Edgar Wright wanted it to be, I'm not exactly, that sort of remains a mystery. From my understanding and from what I've heard, he wanted to lean more into the criminality of Scott Lang and make it more of a redemption story. And Marvel's like, we can't, no, he has to be a good guy from the get-go. And
he's a good thief.
He's a good thief. He only steals from bad people. So yeah, it's, I definitely think that Paul Rudd's sensibilities help. I will say, speaking as someone, I did not convert to Judaism. I was raised Jewish. One thing about these sort of actors playing these roles is, I think, pretty great. Growing up, like going to Sunday school, we weren't really given a lot of positive reasons about being Jewish. You were basically taught, and maybe this was just a reflection on my poor Sunday school, but it's just like, there was a Holocaust and you're lucky to be here. And so I feel like that's a shame, because there are all these great things that you could teach young, Jewish kids about, things to have pride in, like, Stan Lee is Jewish, and, these actors that play the characters you love are Jewish. Paul Rudd is a Jewish guy, but he can also be a superhero and be Ant-Man, and, don't you like Ant-Man? So, don't you like Wonder Woman? And I think it's important to sort of have those positive role models, even if on some level it's a bit like Adam Sandler's Hanukkah song, where it's like, here are some people who are Jewish. And it's not so much about the characters they play.
Yeah, representation matters. I mean, look, I get it's my blind spot, but it is interesting to me that the Ant-Man of the movies is arguably, if Spider-Man is the most nebbishy superhero, then Ant-Man is the second most nebbishy superhero. And the irony there is, I think most people in the audience have no idea that Paul Rudd's Jewish, would never in a million years know that. His comedy is like a lighter version of the Jewish comedy that Seth Rogen has sort of trademarked, that is a little bit slacker, stoner, but it's just like a little bit less hard-edged than the Seth Rogen. And that is a distinct stream of Jewish comedy that's developed in the past 20 years. And Paul Rudd has been a big part of that. And so for me, it's interesting to see that character, because it is so different than the way that the character exists in the comic books. It's interesting to me. To flip that, though, there is an actress who I think most people do recognize as a Jewish actress, who has been very outspoken and proud about her Judaism, and that is Natalie Portman, who also is in the Marvel Cinematic Universe and is scheduled to play a female version of Thor, which I'm sure will not rile up any fanboys at all. To me, that's the most, when I think about representation and I think about young Jews, particularly Jewish women looking, like that's the one I'm most excited about. Sarah, I don't know how you feel about it.
You know how I feel about it. I'm so excited for that Thor entry. I mean, Taika Waititi coming back to direct, obviously. He's probably another one some people don't realize is part Jewish. And he did so well with Thor Ragnarok, and I just think Natalie Portman, I feel like I'm going to find an opportunity during most episodes to just talk about how much I love Natalie Portman. I don't care how many fanboys it upsets. I think it's going to be awesome. And I want to go back to something really quick, though, Brad, about Paul Rudd. See, I think that the star text around him having been in all of those comedies, I mean, most of the prominent cast members in those comedies are Jewish. And so I find it surprising to think about the amount of people potentially going to see the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, not realizing that he's Jewish, and the fact that the character isn't. I don't know. I never untangled Paul Rudd's sort of uniqueness, his unique sensibility and sense of humor, from the fact that he is Jewish and from the fact that he is from that kind of comedy community, if you will.
Yeah, I think you and I, who are Jewish and who are film scholarly adjacent, if not film scholars, we know all the Jewish actors and directors, and we kind of, are paying attention to it. I think the average audience, Seth Rogen as a counterpoint, who also has affected a kind of mass appeal around a slightly slackerish, actually very slackerish stoner vibe. Like, he's also made films and portrayed characters and talked very openly about being Jewish in a way that Paul Rudd, who has done that, but Paul there's no one character that anyone can point to of Paul Rudd's that's like, oh, that's a super Jewy character that is like that's identified with him. He has affected a kind of everyman quality where he just is likable to everybody. He just is. And I think his part of that is because he's sort of devoid of religiosity in terms of how he's been portrayed and the roles that he's chosen. He's devoid of. It's funny because he's kind of his characters are there's a white bread quality to them. And maybe I'm wrong, but I would be willing to bet if you did a survey of the United States of America movie watching public that you would find, and you said, who knows that Paul Rudd's Jewish, that most people would be like, oh, I had no idea that he was Jewish. Which is not the case for someone like Seth Rogen, which is not the case for someone like Natalie Portman. I think that there's just been certainly Gal Gadot. Way more people know that Gal Gadot is Israeli than know that Paul Rudd's Jewish. And so to me, but I also can't help but look at Paul Rudd and go, Jewish humor, very distinctly. There's a sensibility there, and it comes through in Ant-Man.
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent people know that Gal Gadot is Israeli, but they're not taking the second step of saying, oh, well, that means she's probably Jewish, and like kind of really knowing, really taking that into account, which I think is interesting that, some people might not make that second kind of leap.
She's not bringing I don't think she's bringing anything Jewish to the character, to the movie, to the portrayal. She's certainly raising issues around, there's a lot of controversy, but this is more the director. I think this is not so much Gal Gadot as it is when you look at the controversy around the portrayal of her and the outfits that she and her fellow Amazonians wear in Wonder Woman, and then you go and look at the criticism of the outfits they were given for Justice League and the way in which they were sexualized in Justice League under a male director, two male directors, and the way that they were not in the hands of a female director for Wonder Woman. Like, there's nothing Jewish about that conversation. It's a feminist discussion. Or the Arab-Israeli conflict in the way that certain Arab countries were like, we're not going to show Wonder Woman. It's like, okay, but the problem that I have is Gal Gadot is not bringing anything that I would consider Jewish cultural, grist into the mill of Wonder Woman. And so I just sort of look at it and I kind of shrug. Whereas I look at Paul Rudd and I go, yeah, you definitely brought something Jewish to the table for Ant-Man. And it's going to fly over the heads of most of the audience. But I, as a Jew watching that, get it.
So also the fact that you mentioned Seth Rogen makes me realize we do not have time to discuss the fact that he was in Green Hornet. That's probably a whole other can of worms. But what I do want to kind of end on is if we could just kind of do an honorable mentions round. I would love to just see if there are other characters or creators or actors that we haven't gotten to talk about that we just want to put out there for further thought for our listeners. Like, I would like to go first if I could and just mention that Jeff Goldblum in Thor Ragnarok is the most Jeff Goldblum he's ever been and ever will be. And the fact that he just plays Jeff Goldblum is amazing to me. And I love that Taika Waititi just let him run with that and be Jeff Goldblum. So that's mine.
I'm convinced that they didn't give him a script for that movie. They just said, here's what's going to be happening in this scene, Jeff. Just kind of be you and just kind of run with it.
Accurate. That's probably accurate.
I will go second. And I will say that I did not realize until doing research for this podcast that Harley Quinn is Jewish, but it makes a lot of sense now to go back and look at her roots, both the character and the way the character has sort of developed, but also the creators who helped kind of establish the tropes of that character and the way in which Jewish stereotypes and Jewish stylings and the whole mother-daughter Jewish relationship, which is a trope of Jewish comedy, has played into Harley Quinn as a character that fascinates me. I always knew that the Thing was Jewish. I knew Magneto. I knew, Scarlet Witch and all these other characters were Jewish. But to find out that Harley Quinn, who is a character that most people probably didn't really pay any attention to outside of hardcore comic book fans, 10 years ago, is Jewish, but also, she's having this moment to me is a source of great enthusiasm and interest on my part. Matt, you got honorable mentions?
I give a little shout out to Michael Douglas, for being Ant-Man is going to be Jewish somehow, no matter what. If it's not Paul Rudd, it's the previous Ant-Man, Hank Pym. So, nice little shout out to Michael Douglas right there.
The reality is there's so many Jewish creators of comic book stories. We did not talk about Batman and Bob Kane and Bill Finger. We haven't talked about Will Eisner. We haven't talked about Jack Kirby. We haven't talked about all of these creators, and the list goes on, and there's other Jewish characters. So we could literally do a whole series of episodes that just dives into different aspects of the Jewish imprint that has been left on superheroes and superhero movies. So on that note, I think we can wrap things up. Matt, thank you again for joining us and for bringing your expertise and behind-the-scenes knowledge to this conversation. It's been wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
On that note, I think I will have to rewatch all of my superhero movie Blu-rays this week. I certainly have more to think about when I revisit them.
And I think I love these movies even more now, and hope our listeners will feel the same. Until next time, we are your hosts, Sarah Glassberg
and Brad Pilcher.
Also producing are Catherine Crosby and Chris Holland, who is also our technical director and editor, and Catherine Cole, our show intern.
Thank you again to our special guest this week, Matt Goldberg.
The music you've been humming to all show long is by the incomparable Joe Alterman. Please look him up wherever you get your music.
You can always find more from us, as well as show notes at ajff.org/inconversation. Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a line with questions, and we just might answer in future episodes.
Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice, or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating, a review. Every little bit helps.
And of course, please tell your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.